I'd like to encourage you to be turning with me to Matthew chapter 24 as we continue our study in this prophecy. Now, as we get down in Matthew chapter 24, we noted of all these signs and all of the things that people get so excited about, beginning down in about verse 6 and following. Now, as we look at Matthew 24, it is important for us to understand that Jesus is talking to these folks in this generation. That's a key factor here. So he notes that these things are going to be happening and there's going to be some changes. And that goes down to verse 8. Where it says, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Things are going to change. Things are going to be different. Now, last Wednesday evening, we talked about the tribulation that they were going to endure. And he talked about the sad situation that was going to happen. You know, families were going to turn on family members, and brothers turn on brothers, and fathers and mothers turn on children, and children turn on their parents, and you know, the people that you know is going to turn on you, and things are just going to be pretty bad. And that was what was happening back before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. He talked about the lawlessness. And you know, that was a reality by this time period. People were pretty lawless. And remember what I've talked about, the Jewish revolt. This revolt began, of course, sometime back in the 60s, and it didn't end. It's still going on in some essences. This lawlessness and the wars brought on because of the situation there. In verse 13 he says, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now that's a key, because we want to endure through what he's prophesying. And that is all of these terrible things, this tribulation that's going to happen in that generation. Now, Jesus is not talking about something that's going to happen in our future, but in this generation. And he says, you can endure it to the end. Verse 14. He says, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And we noted that in that known world, that the gospel had been taken out into that area, that known world. Now, from this point on, he's going to give them instructions on how to be saved from what's going to happen in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. He's going to tell them, now this is what you need to do. He gets down to verse 15 in Matthew chapter 24. And he talks about the abomination of desolation, which, remember that Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience. They would have recalled the abomination of desolation back in Daniel, back in the destruction of the temple previously. They would have understood this. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. They understood what he was talking about. And because we have Daniel, We can go back and we've studied that and we've talked about that. And that is where they, in essence, took a pig and roasted it on the altar. And it was unclean from then, at the time. And that was bringing on the Babylonian captivity and all of those types of things. In the Gospel of Mark, the 13th chapter, in verse 14, he uses the same wordage. It says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be," let the reader understand, "then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." In other words, we go all the way back to Jesus talking about the temple being destroyed. But these individuals would have understood that not only was the temple going to be destroyed, but there was going to be that desolation of everything. And they're going to take and they're going to do things on the altar that will again make the altar unclean. Now this takes us back to Daniel chapter 9, beginning in verse 26, where it says that after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many of 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolation, even until the complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So they understood that what had happened previously to the temple was going to happen again. That's what Daniel's talking about here. That's what Jesus is talking about here in these two passages. Well, if we look at verse 16 of Matthew 24, it says, "Then those who are in Judea, when this happens," let the reader understand means they understood it. So when this is happening, get out, flee to the mountains. In Mark 13:14, again, the last part of that says, "Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." Now remember that these are being written to the audiences, these individuals, but most of these talking to are Christians, because the Jews had rejected Christ. They had rejected the teachings of Jesus. They had rejected him for sure. So here's the situation is, you Christians, when you see this abomination happening, you need to go. And that's what he's bringing to light here. Now, in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, he puts it like this. He says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near." And again, the Jewish revolt, all of these things are going on. And not only had the Romans came in at this time when he's talking about it, but then here we find Vespasian comes in. We also find that Vespasian goes back to Rome. Titus comes in and just literally destroys everything. So we're looking at the first time that the Roman army surrounds Jerusalem. Now, in AD 70, Titus took it all out. He uh, abomination of desolation. They actually uh, uh, put a pig on the altar and the whole thing. From that time forward, if you go back and you look at the history and what was going on, the Jewish religion was banned, and they were at war with the Romans. They were at war with everybody because it was banned. They couldn't do anything. The temple was destroyed, and we'll get into a little bit more of that as that goes along. But the key is when this happens, you need to flee to the mountains. You need to get out. And it denotes the idea when this army comes and surrounds Jerusalem. Now, Jesus answers the disciples' questions. What sign will there be when these things take place? And remember, these things is the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the question. It's in their generation. Well, Josephus at length explains that the Roman general Scythius brought a massive Roman army against Jerusalem. So this is the first army that comes in here. And I don't know if you can see that very well, but the army came in from the north, went to Ptolemais, Caesarea, over to Separias. I don't know why some of these words are difficult. Joppa, Antipas, Lydia, Bethhorn, and then to Jerusalem. Now, one of the things that we find when we look at history is that when he came in, Scythius, he was the Roman general. He's coming in with the army, and the army always came down along the side of the Mediterranean here. Well, he did not go in and destroy all of these cities. He went in there to some of those cities and got foodstuffs for his army. Some of these cities says, oh yeah, don't worry about it, just come in. It was not as destructive, let's put it that way, as it was when Titus came back and destroyed everything. Now in Josephus' Word of the Jews 2:19-4, it says, but now Scythius observed that the disturbance that were begun among the Jews afforded him a proper opportunity to attack them, took his whole army along with him, and put the Jews to flight and pursued them into Jerusalem. So here he comes down and he goes through all of these cities. He's heading into Jerusalem, and the people in Jerusalem were fearful. They were afraid of this Roman army. So they kind of retreated back toward Jerusalem, the Jews did. Some of them didn't. Some of them stayed in these communities that's along here that he just kind of went along, and some of these places, like I said, he went to get foodstuffs out of these communities. But Jerusalem, the people in Jerusalem was not standing against him. They were retreating. They were fearful of what was going on. Now, going back over to Luke 21, it says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. Now, Jesus is preparing them to get out of the way of all of these things that are fixing to happen. And Zacchaeus' behavior provides something that's kind of remarkable here. Josephus notes that those in Jerusalem, they didn't think that they could take the Roman army. So they retreated into the city. Jesus is telling us here, look, when this happens and you get the opportunity to get out, you get out. And you don't make any date to go to Jerusalem. You just don't go there. You stay away. Well, Josephus writes in 2:19-4 of the War of the Jews. In fact, he stated that he had but at this very time attempted to get within the walls by force. He had won the city presently, and the war had been put an end to at once. The Roman army came into Jerusalem. All they had to do was push the door open because the Jews were fearful of the Romans, and they would have taken Jerusalem. It wouldn't have been that big a deal. It wouldn't have been that difficult for them to just walk on in and take advantage, and they did, but that's not what happened. Scythius retreated. He took his army and left. Well, Josephus talks about this, and he says, it then happened that Scythius was not conscious either how the besieged despair of success or how courageous the people were for him. And so he recalled his soldiers from the place, and by despairing of an expectation of taking it, without having received any disgrace, he retired from the city without any reason in the world. He just backed off. Well, if you go back and you read through all of this thing, that emboldened the Jews. That emboldened them. So here his army's backing off. They are loaded with their foodstuffs. They're loaded with their weapons. They're not moving very fast. So the Jews come out of Jerusalem, and they go out here and they start attacking the Roman army. And they killed a bunch of them. And some of the people in the Roman army threw down the things they were carrying and ran away. Well, that's not quite a good idea if you're a general. But that's what happened. And you can go back and look at the War of the Jews 2:19-7, and you can read all about that. Now, going down to the War of the Jews 2:19-6, it says, in his struggle to understand why the events occurred as they did, Josephus suggests that Cetus would have ended the war at that point, but the reason he did not was owing to the aversion God had already at the city and the sanctuary, that he was hindered from putting an end to the war that very day. Now, remember, old Josephus was a Jew, he was a Roman, and he was a Roman historian. We don't find anywhere that he was a Christian or knew anything about what had been written in Matthew chapter 24 and the parallels. Don't know that he knew anything about that. But what he does know, that the war could have come to an end. They could have taken Jerusalem. It would have been over and done with, but he didn't. And that was a difficulty. So we think about the army comes up here. They're going to take the city. All these Christians are still in the city, and they have no way out. But Jesus told them to flee when they see this happening. Now, remember, we're still in this deal in their generation. We're still in this deal. These are what's going to happen. Here's the Roman army. But they backed up. They left and went a distance away. I don't remember exactly how far that distance was. So what does Jesus tell them to do? In essence, this gives them an opening to get out of Dodge. Nope, get out of Jerusalem. This gives an opening for the Christians to get out. Now, we go back to Matthew 24, 16 through 22. Again, let me reiterate. This is happening in their generation. This is what Jesus told them to do. Matthew 24, 16. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. In other words, when you see this happening, you better have already been ready. Don't go down from your housetop and get the things out of your house. Just get to the mountains. Get out. This is going to be bad. Verse 18. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. So if you're out in the field and you're plowing or whatever you're doing, when you see the Roman army coming over the hill, don't go back and get your cloak. Get to the mountains. Verse 19. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Well, in this context, it denotes the thing that it's a struggle if you're expecting to walk all the way to get away from the Romans. Now, you know, most of us we've had kids. I know how hard it was for Linda to, she, little old girl, expecting. She didn't get around very good. Or if you've got to load up everything for the kids. Now, I tell you what, I never could figure out why we had to take so much stuff for the kids, but I was sure thankful we did. Because we loaded up when we took the kids. Well, that's the same story is what he's talking about here. He says in verse 20, but pray that your flight is not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. In the wintertime, it's cold. And you've got to make this journey to get away, to flee Jerusalem. And you know how difficult it is to travel in the winter? And the Sabbath. They locked the place up on the Sabbath. Nobody comes in. Nobody goes out. So you're stuck. That's what he's talking about here. Now I know somebody's going to come along and they're going to say, well, this is talking about the time that Jesus is coming back and he's going to rapture all these people. That's not what it's talking about. Because I don't see any Roman armies. And that's a key. You got to have that Roman army come up to Jerusalem. Now, again, they backed up. We have a time period here that they could get out of Jerusalem. The Jews, instead of leaving Jerusalem, they attacked the Roman army. The Christians, they got out of Jerusalem. And most of them went south, down around Pela. In that area down there, we'll talk a little bit more about this possibly here in a moment. The Jewish generals taken captive by Romans, or a Jewish general that had been taken captive by the Romans, just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, made this summary, and I quote, all the calamity which had befallen any nation from the beginning of the world were but small in comparison to those of the Jews. In the siege of Jerusalem, no fewer than 1,100,000 perished. When more than 3 million were assembled. That's a lot of folks. The surrounding provinces, about 250,000 were slain. 97,000 were taken captive. Some were killed by beasts in the Roman theaters. Some sent to work in Egypt, and others were sold as slaves. That's kind of a bad deal. 3 million people in Jerusalem. That's a lot of folks. Now, the Christians were only a few of those. And in essence, right here it notes, whatever you're doing, drop it and go. Verse 21, Matthew chapter 24. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So they had to get out. They had to leave. And that's what they're being told. Don't get stuck. And when you go back and you read about the siege of Jerusalem, it is a horrible tribulation that those folks went under. After Titus and that Roman army came back, if you were to leave and try to get away and got caught, it was awful. You wasn't going to live. It was, you just wasn't getting away. 3 million people in there at that time period, and 1,100,000 or so, whatever, didn't make it. So Citrus's retreat was a unique thing. Luke 21 says, 23 and 24, Luke 21, 23 and 24 says, Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And we'll talk about all those cities north of Jerusalem had already been destroyed in AD 70. Now see, this is before AD 70. This is probably around 66, something along that line. Well, the flight from Jerusalem, Citrus retreated, provide that perfect opportunity for the Christians in Jerusalem to flee from that city. Eusebius writes in Church History 353, he says, But the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by a revelation, vouchsafe, to approve men there before the war to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Pera called Pella. And when those that believed in Christ had come there from Jerusalem, then, as if the royal city of the Jews and the whole land of Judea were entirely destitute of holy men, the judgment of God at length overtook those who committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles, and totally destroyed that generation of impetuous men. So in essence, these Christians went down to Pera or Pela, and all the rest of them or 1,100,000 got killed. And then a lot of them were taken to Rome to be used in sport. Others went to Egypt, as I noted a minute ago. So what he's talking about here to the Christians is to get out, simply. Doesn't have anything to do with what is commonly promoted in our society today. This idea that Jesus is going to come back and there's going to be a guy over there and, he's going to be on the rooftop and he's going to be a working and then he's going to be gone. And the guy next to him is going to be left there. And talks about, all of those so-called signs. No, that's not what it's talking about here. Keep things in context. It's a key factor. Over the last, 2 months, we've been hearing about the eclipse. And we're still hearing about the eclipse. I don't know if you guys took the opportunity to go out and see the eclipse, but to my understanding, that was promoted on it was on TV, it was on the news, it was all over the internet, that the end of the world was coming, the rapture was coming during the eclipse. We talked about that back when we talked about the rapture on Wednesday night lessons, so you can go back and study that. French word. Okay. Linda says, let's go out in the yard. So I told her, I said, all right. I was busy. So went out and I got the old nasty chair off the back porch and Linda brings out her nice little pretty one. We sat down out there. I said, well, if I'm going to go, I better go get my bag. So I went and got my suitcase, put me in some clothes and brought it out there and set it by my chair. And I just sat there with my little glasses on. We had some of them funky glasses. I don't think those are going to be very good for welding because the welding is going to eat them up pretty quick. But they worked real good to watch the sun. We sat out there in the yard and I saw it begin and I just knew I was going to go. I just knew it. I sat there and it went, there was a quarter. There was a half. There was about 3/4. And then there was just a little sliver. And then it started going by. And I knew that I must be a sinful man. Because I was still sitting there with my clothes. That's what people believe, though. Think about this. People believed that was going to happen. It didn't. Well, to be honest with you, I knew it wasn't going to, so Linda and I was just sitting out there. We did have Jackson, our cat, he did have to come do that with us. And don't use passages like Matthew 24 or Luke or Mark. Don't use those to promote an ideology that it's not talking about. Now, in Epiphanius writes in the 4th century, he's another early writer, says the sect of the Nazarenes, in other words, the Christians, is to be found in Beoria near Colia, Syria, in Decapolis near Pella. For that was the place of origin, since all the disciples had settled in Pella after their removal from Jerusalem, Christ having told them to abandon Jerusalem and withdraw from it because of the siege it was about to undergo. So we're just 4 centuries ahead here, looking back at what happened. So that's what the Christians did. Josephus mentioned that after Cetus retreated, many Jews swarmed from the city as from a ship when it was going to sink. And the Jews went to fight the Romans. The Christians went south. That's what happened. The Romans, when Titus comes in, went back into the city and were besieged. And we'll talk about that a little later when we have opportunity. In Matthew 24, 23 through 28, he repeats what he had talked about up there in about verse 5, I believe. Down here. Verse 5 says, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead you." Starting here in verse 23 and going to 28, again he talks about these false Christs, these false prophets that would come to try to lead them astray. And I'll let you guys look at that, and we'll begin down in about verse 30 next Wednesday evening. So we see the same thing again over in Luke chapter 17, verses 22 through 24. So we'll stop there tonight. And just remember, this prophecy was in those people's future. It concluded, it was fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. The Christians went to Pella, and history points it out. The Bible points it out. Hasn't got anything to do with what's commonly taught in our world today. So we'll stop there and begin again next week. No, we won't. Week after next.